Picture this. You're driving through a neighborhood built in 1955. Every house on the block is brick. Solid, thick, the kind that looks like it was built with the specific intention of outlasting everyone involved in making it. The mortar is stained with decades. The color has deepened into something that looks less like a material choice and more like the earth itself deciding to become a building. Now drive through a subdivision built in 2005. Vinyl siding, fiber cement board, maybe a brick facade on the front, just the front, like a costume a house puts on for company and then takes off around the back where nobody's looking. And here's the part that should bother you more than it does. That thin layer of brick on the front, it's not structural, it's decorative. It is literally wallpaper pretending to be a wall. The actual house behind it is wood frame and OSB-oriented strand board, which is essentially compressed wood chips and glue engineered to behave like lumber until it gets wet, at which point it begins its rapid and committed return to the earth. So what happened? America built in brick for over 200 years. Cities, row houses, farmhouses, schools, factories, brick was the default, the assumed material, the thing you used when you were building something you intended to still be there when you were gone. And then, somewhere between the post-war boom and the McMansion era, it almost completely vanished from American residential construction. Not because brick stopped working. Brick still works exactly as well as it always did. A brick wall built in 1880 is standing right now. The brick house your grandparents grew up in is probably still standing. The brick school you attended, if it predates 1970, is almost certainly still standing and will outlast every vinyl-sided house currently under construction in America. The new house down the street, built 5 years ago, is already showing cracks in the trim. The caulk around the windows is separating. The fiber cement is beginning to show moisture damage at the joints. So this is not a story about technology improving. This is not a story about a better material replacing an inferior one. This is a story about priorities shifting, about who benefits when a house is built faster and cheaper, and what gets permanently lost when permanence stops being the point. This is what really killed the American brick house, and why it matters a great deal more than most people have stopped to consider. Like this video if you've ever driven through a new subdivision and felt vaguely cheated without being able to explain exactly why. Subscribe because this channel is about the hidden logic behind things Americans stopped questioning and started quietly paying for. Let's go. Part 1. What America actually built for 200 years. Before we talk about what killed the brick house, we need to establish what the brick house actually was. Because the version most people picture, the neat colonial with black shutters and a centered chimney, is only one chapter of a much longer and more democratic story than that image suggests. Americans built in brick because brick was the rational choice for most of American history, and the reasoning was not complicated. Brick doesn't rot. Brick doesn't burn. Brick doesn't warp in humidity or crack in cold. It doesn't provide a food source for termites. It doesn't off-gas chemicals as it ages. A properly built brick wall will outlast the people who laid it, their children, and their children's children, without requiring anything beyond basic maintenance and occasional tuck pointing. The process of refreshing the mortar between courses, which a competent homeowner can learn to do on a Saturday afternoon. In a country that had watched entire cities burn, Chicago in 1871, San Francisco in 1906, Peshtigo, Wisconsin in 1871, in a fire that killed more people than Chicago's, but gets a fraction of the historical coverage. Fire resistance wasn't an aesthetic preference. It was survival logic expressed in construction material. The earliest American brick construction dates to the 1600s in Virginia and Massachusetts. Colonists, who had watched wooden structures burn and decided to import the material knowledge they carried from England. By the 1700s, brick was the prestige material of American cities. Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, Richmond, Charleston. The architectural identity of early America is, almost entirely, brick. The buildings that survived, the buildings we now call historic. The buildings tourists pay money to stand in front of and photograph. And critically, this is the part that gets lost in the popular imagination. It was not just wealthy construction. Working-class row houses in Baltimore and Philadelphia were brick. Factory worker housing in New England mill towns was brick. The tenements of American industrial cities, for all their other failures of space and ventilation, were built in brick because brick was simply the standard material for urban construction, the baseline, not the luxury tier. By the late 1800s, American brick production was industrial in scale and national in reach. The Hudson Valley alone, specifically the stretch of river between New York City and Albany, had over 100 brick manufacturing operations running simultaneously at peak production. The brick that built significant portions of New York City came up that river on barges. Cities had local brick industries the way they had local lumber yards and local newspapers. The material was present, affordable, and expected. Here is a number worth sitting with for a moment. At the peak of American brick residential construction in the early 20th century, somewhere between 60 and 75% of new urban housing was built with masonry as a primary structural component. Not decorative, structural. The brick wasn't on the house. The brick was the house. It was load-bearing. It was the wall. It was the thing standing between the family inside and the weather outside, doing that job without a single additional layer of sheathing, wrapping, siding, or painted board. By 2020, that number for new residential construction had fallen to somewhere between 8 and 10% nationally. And in most of the fast-growing Sunbelt markets driving American housing construction today, Phoenix, Dallas, Charlotte, Atlanta, the entire Florida peninsula, the number is functionally close to zero. New residential construction in these markets is almost universally wood frame, with a cladding product on the exterior, whether that's vinyl, fiber cement, stucco over foam board, or the thin decorative brick veneer that performs the visual suggestion of permanence without the structural reality of it. That is not a gradual evolution. That is not the natural arc of material science improving and replacing something inferior. That is a collapse. A deliberate, economically motivated collapse, and it happened for reasons that have very little to do with whether brick is a good building material, because brick remains, by almost every objective metric, an exceptional building material, and everything to do with speed, profit margin, and a fundamental restructuring of who American housing was being built for and what their builders owed them in terms of longevity. Part 2. The moment everything changed. To understand when the brick house started dying, you need to go back to one specific moment in American history. Not a law, not a technological invention, not a design movement. The federal government, through the GI Bill passed in 1944 and the Federal Housing Administration operating since 1934, but now massively empowered, decides to solve this problem with a combination of guaranteed mortgages, favorable loan terms, and the active encouragement of new suburban residential construction. The FHA begins insuring low-interest loans, specifically designed for new builds on the suburban periphery of American cities. This policy choice, favoring new suburban construction over existing urban housing stock, simultaneously creates the American suburb as we know it and begins the deliberate disinvestment of American cities that will play out over the next 40 years. But that is a different and equally important video. What matters here is one word: speed. The country needs hundreds of thousands of houses. It needs them within months, not years. It needs them affordable to returning veterans on middle-class wages. And brick, with all its permanence, all its durability, all its centuries of proven performance, has a problem that suddenly, in 1945, matters enormously. Brick is slow. A skilled mason, working at professional pace, can lay approximately 500 bricks per day under good conditions. That sounds productive, until you understand that a modest single-family home requires somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 bricks in its construction, which means a single mason needs 3 to 4 weeks on one house, assuming no rain delays, no material delivery issues, no scaffolding complications. And masonry is a skilled trade. You cannot train someone to lay brick competently in a week. You cannot flood the labor market with brick masons the way you can flood it with carpenters swinging nail guns. Wood frame construction, by contrast, is dramatically faster. A wood frame for a modest single-family home can go up in days with a reasonably sized crew. The skills required are more broadly distributed. The tools are simpler. The material is lighter, the supply chain is more flexible, and critically, in 1945, the American lumber industry had just spent 4 years supplying a global military conflict and had developed production capacity and logistical infrastructure that dwarfed anything the brick industry could match. So the decision, from the perspective of anyone trying to house 16 million veterans as quickly as possible, was not really a decision at all. Wood frame won by default, not because it was better, because it was faster, because the urgency of the moment privileged speed over longevity in a way that seemed entirely reasonable in 1945 and whose consequences we are still living in. Enter William Levitt. His name is probably familiar even if the full scope of what he did isn't. Levitt was a developer who applied assembly line manufacturing logic to residential construction with a thoroughness and scale that nobody had attempted before. He broke the construction of a house into 27 discrete sequential steps, each performed by a specialized crew that did one thing and moved to the next house. No single worker needed to know how to build a house. Each worker needed to know how to do one step repeatedly, all day, at maximum speed. The result was Levittown, New York, 17,447 homes built on Long Island potato farms between 1947 and 1951. At peak production, Levitt's operation was completing 36 houses per day. 36 houses per day, not a week. A day, not one of them was brick. Every single Levittown house was wood frame, with an asphalt shingle roof and an exterior cladding that prioritized cost and installation speed over longevity. They were good houses for what they were: affordable, functional, available, and delivered at a scale and pace that genuinely held house a generation. But they were built to a different standard than the brick houses they were replacing as the American residential ideal. And when Levittown became the national template, when developers across the country looked at Levitt's profit margins and his production speed and said, essentially, that the die was cast. The American residential construction industry reorganized itself around wood frame, not because wood frame was superior, because wood frame was profitable at scale in a way that masonry constructional could not match, and because the post-war housing emergency gave the industry the specific historical moment it needed to make that reorganization feel not just acceptable, but patriotic. Part 3. The marketing machine that finished the job speed and economics started the shift away from brick, but something else finished it. And this is the part of the story that deserves more attention than it typically gets. The appliance and home construction industries of the 1950s were not passive beneficiaries of the post-war housing boom. They were active participants in shaping what Americans wanted their homes to be, and crucially, in shaping what Americans were willing to accept as modern versus what they were persuaded to see as old-fashioned. The same marketing infrastructure that sold Americans the electric clothes dryer as a symbol of progress over the outdoor clothesline, we covered that in a previous video, was simultaneously at work on the house itself. Modernity was being defined in real time by people with a financial interest in the definition. Brick, in this marketing environment, began to accumulate associations with the past, with the old world, with the immigrant neighborhoods of American cities that the suburbs were explicitly designed as an escape from. The brick row house of Baltimore or the brick three-flat of Chicago was associated with density, with urban life, with the working-class circumstances that the post-war generation had been promised they were leaving behind. The new house, light-colored, wide-lotted, clad in materials that looked crisp and clean and fresh, was associated with arrival, with having made it, with the future. This was not an accident. Home builders, material manufacturers, and the advertising industry worked in active coordination to construct these associations. Architectural magazines of the 1950s and early 1960s are full of language equating traditional masonry construction with the past and light frame suburban construction with progress. The words modern and new and American appear constantly in proximity to the wood frame ranch house. The brick house, by quiet implication, was what you left when you moved up. And Americans in enormous numbers believed it because they wanted to, because the promise was appealing, because the mortgage was affordable and the house was available and the yard was real and the children could go to the new school in the new district, and the whole thing felt like the country delivering on a promise that the war years had deferred. What nobody examined closely at the time, because who examines the fine print of a promise that's being kept, was what was actually being traded away. The brick house wasn't just a material, it was a philosophy of construction. It said something specific about the relationship between a builder and the person who would live in the building. It said, this house is meant to outlast both of us. It said, I am building this for someone I will never meet 3 generations from now, and I am building it accordingly. The post-war wood frame house said something different. It said, this house is meant to be affordable right now and adequate for a generation. It said, the value here is in the access, not the permanence. It said in the language of economics rather than architecture, this is a consumer product, not a monument. Both of these are coherent positions, but only one of them was presented transparently. The other was packaged as progress. Part 4. The Builder's Incentive Problem. Here is a structural reality of American residential construction that most home buyers are never told directly, even though it shapes everything about the house they're purchasing. The person who builds your house does not live in your house. This sounds obvious, but follow the logic of it all the way through because the implications are significant. A production home builder, the category of developer responsible for the vast majority of new American residential construction, builds houses to sell them. Their business model requires building as many houses as possible, as quickly as possible, at margins that allow the business to grow. The quality of the house past the point required to pass inspection and attract a buyer is a cost, not an investment. Every dollar spent on a more durable roofing material, a thicker wall assembly, a higher grade window, is a dollar that reduces the margin on that unit. The builder will not be living with the consequences of those decisions. The buyer will. And the buyer, in most cases, is making the largest purchase of their life with incomplete information about what they're actually buying. In a transaction where the asymmetry of knowledge between builder and buyer is enormous and entirely normalized, this creates what economists call a principal-agent problem. The agent, the builder, is supposed to be acting in the interest of the principal, the buyer. But the builder's actual financial incentives run in the opposite direction of the buyer's long-term interest. The buyer wants durability. The builder is rewarded for speed and margin. The buyer will live with the waterproofing decisions for 30 years. The builder will be across the country finishing the next subdivision before the first winter rain hits. This problem is not unique to housing construction. But housing construction has a specific feature that makes it particularly acute. Building codes set minimums, not standards. A code-compliant house is a house that meets the legal floor, the threshold below which a structure becomes unsafe or legally uninhabitable. Code compliance does not mean the house is built well. It means the house is built to the minimum standard required by law, by inspectors who are checking boxes on a form during a brief site visit, not quality assessing a complex assembly of thousands of components installed by dozens of subcontractors under time pressure. Brick construction, as a practical matter, tends to produce houses that exceed those minimums by a significant margin, not because brick builders are more virtuous, but because the material itself and the skills required to work with it have built-in quality floors that are higher than the code minimums. You cannot rush good brickwork without it being visible and wrong. The craft has self-correcting mechanisms. Wood frame construction with low-grade cladding products has no such mechanism. You can install OSB sheathing improperly in ways that won't show problems for 5 years. You can flash windows incorrectly in ways that won't produce visible water damage for a decade. You can use the minimum grade house wrap and never know it until moisture infiltration has damaged the wall assembly behind a surface that still looks perfectly fine from the street. The builder is long gone. The warranty, if there is one, has expired. The homeowner is holding the bag, the moisture meter, and a repair estimate that begins with a number they weren't prepared for. Part 5. The labor equation nobody talks about. There's another piece of the story that doesn't get enough attention, and it connects directly to why brick, even among builders who might prefer it for quality reasons, has become structurally difficult to choose in modern American construction. The skilled masonry trades in America are in crisis. This is not a new problem, but it is an accelerating one. The pipeline of skilled masons. People trained in bricklaying, block laying, stonework, and the broader craft of masonry construction has been declining for decades. The vocational education infrastructure that once trained generations of American tradespeople was systematically defunded and deprioritized through the 1980s and 1990s in favor of college track education models. The cultural messaging around trades work shifted from respected skilled craft to fallback option. And the construction industry, having reorganized itself around wood frame production, stopped needing masons at scale and therefore stopped training them at scale. The result is a labor market where skilled masons are genuinely scarce and therefore expensive in ways that compound the already significant material cost advantage of wood frame construction. In markets where brick construction is still common, parts of Texas, portions of the Mid-Atlantic, some Midwest metros, the cost premium for a fully masonry house over a comparable wood frame house ranges from 15 to 30% in construction costs. That is a real number that shows up in the mortgage and the monthly payment and the affordability calculation that a buyer makes when they're choosing between two houses. The brick house is better. The brick house will last longer. The brick house will require less maintenance over its life cycle. But the brick house costs more on the day of purchase, and American housing finance is structured around the purchase price and the monthly payment, not the 50-year cost of ownership. So buyers, guided by the financing math and not the longevity math, choose the wood frame house with the better kitchen Because it's $30,000 cheaper. The builder, guided by the margin math and the labor availability math, builds more wood frame houses with better kitchens. And the masonry trade continues to shrink because the market for its skills continues to shrink. This is a self-reinforcing loop, and it has been running for 70 years. Part 6. What we actually lost. Let's talk about what a building is supposed to do. Not in the code compliance sense. In the genuine civilizational sense. A building is a repository of human effort and resources. It represents the labor of the people who built it, the materials extracted from the earth to construct it, the energy used in its production. A building that lasts 100 years amortizes all of that effort and resource extraction across a century of use. A building that lasts 30 years before requiring significant reconstruction or demolition amortizes it across 30 years and then demands a second investment. The average lifespan of an American wood frame house built after 1950 is estimated at between 40 and 80 years, depending on maintenance, climate, and construction quality. The average lifespan of a masonry house built before 1930, the brick row houses of Baltimore, the brick bungalows of Chicago, the brick Victorians of St. Louis, is estimated at between 100 and 200 years or more. Many are still well within their structural service life after a century of occupancy. This is not a marginal difference. This is a fundamental difference in the relationship between construction and time. The brick houses of American cities are, in a very literal sense, a form of stored wealth. Every brick house still standing is a house that does not need to be built again, does not require new lumber, new sheathing, new roofing, new windows, new siding. It does not require the energy of production or the carbon of manufacture or the landfill space of demolition. Its maintenance requires ongoing investment, but its structural existence is given, carried forward from the generation that built it to every generation that has inhabited it since. When cities tear down brick housing stock and American urban renewal tore down enormous quantities of it through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, replacing it with nothing, or with parking lots, or with buildings that are themselves now aging poorly, they are destroying stored wealth that cannot be replaced on any reasonable timeline. The brick houses of American cities are not a problem to be solved. They are an inheritance that we have been spending down for 70 years without adequately acknowledging what we're losing, and the houses being built to replace them. In the suburbs, in the exurbs, in the production development spreading across the American landscape, will not be inherited by future generations in the same way. They will, in many cases, be the problem that future generations need to solve. The deferred maintenance, the moisture damage inside the walls, the structural issues that began accumulating on the day the builder moved on to the next project. This is not fatalism. Some wood frame houses are built beautifully and will last generations. Some brick houses are built beautifully and will last generations. Some brick houses are built badly and have failed. Material does not determine outcome by itself. Craft, intention, and ongoing maintenance matter enormously in both cases. But the system, the structural incentives of the American residential construction industry as it has operated since 1945, has not been optimized for longevity. It has been optimized for volume, margin, and the pace of sale, and the material that most clearly represented the alternative to that optimization, brick, masonry, the philosophy of building to last, has been priced, legislated, and culturally persuaded out of the mainstream American housing conversation. Part 7. Is any of this changing? Here's where it gets interesting, because there are signs, real, if small, that the conversation is shifting. The first is climate. As extreme weather events become more frequent and more severe across the American landscape, the fire resistance, wind resistance, and flood resilience of masonry construction are becoming financially legible in ways they weren't before. Insurance companies in high-risk markets are beginning to price the difference. Homeowners in wildfire zones who lost wood frame houses and rebuilt in concrete block or brick are talking publicly about that decision. The performance gap between masonry and light frame construction under extreme conditions is not a theoretical argument anymore. It has been demonstrated repeatedly on video, in real time in neighborhoods where half the houses survived and half didn't, with the survivors correlating strongly with masonry construction. The second is the growing interest in what the construction industry calls durable and resilient building practices. This is a movement, still a minority position within an industry dominated by production builders, but a real one, driven partly by environmental consciousness and partly by home buyers who have watched their parents' wood frame houses age poorly and decided to make different choices. Architects and builders working in this space are vocal, growing in number, and beginning to influence code discussions in ways that could meaningfully shift what gets built. The third is the reconsideration of American urban housing stock. Cities that spent decades demolishing brick housing in the name of urban renewal are now slowly beginning to recognize what they destroyed. Preservation movements are stronger than they were. The adaptive reuse of brick industrial buildings, factories, warehouses, schools, into residential and mixed-use space has become one of the most significant trends in urban development over the last 30 years. There is a market premium in most American cities for a renovated brick building that no developer of new construction can replicate. The market is, quietly, telling us something about what we value. But here's the honest truth about whether brick is coming back to American residential construction in any significant way. It isn't. Not at scale. Not soon. The labor infrastructure is not there. The cost premium is real and significant. The financing system does not reward longevity. The production building industry has no structural incentive to change a model that is working for them. And the cultural associations between new construction and wood frame, between affordability and impermanence, between modernity and the materials of modernity, are deeply embedded after 70 years of reinforcement. What is more likely, and what is already beginning to happen in some markets, is a bifurcation. A small tier of well-resourced buyers, increasingly aware of what they're buying and willing to pay for durability, commissioning, or seeking out masonry construction. And a large mass market continuing to produce and consume wood frame houses built to code minimums, priced for the monthly payment, and designed to work for one generation before requiring the full cycle of investment again. That bifurcation has its own set of problems. About who gets access to the durable housing and who gets the disposable housing. About how housing quality intersects with wealth and race and geography in America in ways that are not accidental. But that too is a different and equally important video. So, what really killed the American brick house? Not a better material, not improved technology, not a smarter way to build. The American brick house was killed by speed, by a post-war emergency that required volume over quality and created an industry around that requirement that never went back. By marketing that repackaged impermanence as progress. By a financing system that rewards purchase price over life cycle value. By an incentive structure in which the person who builds a house bears none of the long-term consequences of how it was built. And by a labor pipeline that was defunded and deprioritized over decades until the trade knowledge required to build in masonry became genuinely scarce. Every one of those forces was a choice, not a natural law, not an inevitable arc of progress, a choice made by people with specific interests at a specific moment in history, packaged as common sense, normalized over generations until it stopped looking like a choice at all. The brick house still works. It still works exactly as well as it ever did. The houses built a century ago are still proving it. What changed is not the material. What changed is what we decided we were building for. Next time you drive past a brick house, a real one, structural, 100 years old, mortar darkened with time, think about the person who laid it. They were building for someone they would never meet. Building for your grandparents, building for your grandparents, building for you if you ended up in that neighborhood. Now think about who's building for your grandchildren. That question has an answer. It just requires reading past the listing photos to find it. If this made you think differently about the house you live in or the one you want to buy, that's the whole point. Like it, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what your house is made of. Bonus points if it's brick, and it's been standing since before your grandparents were born. See you in the next one.